Were you watching the Super Bowl performance wondering,
what is he actually saying?
In this video, I'm not only going to go through what he was saying, but also what us Spanish learners can take from this performance.
Podré para mejorar mi español cuando no tengo mucho tiempo libre para estudiar español.
El video después que acabas de ver me tomó 120 horas de estudio, lo que me ahorró cientos de horas de estudio en comparación con el estudiante medio. Si no me conoces, me llamo Jamí, tengo 16 años, hablo 4 idiomas con fluidez y ayudo a otras personas a hablar español con fluidez más rápido. So firstly, should we even learn Spanish through music? This is something I hear a lot online where people talk about like, oh, it's good to start listening to Spanish music because you'll be immersing yourself in the language. That means that you'll be learning passively. And that whole thing, like, it sounds appealing. And it was appealing to me as well when I first started. I remember when I did start getting into learning Spanish during that summer of 2022, I remember the show that I used to learn Spanish, the actual episode, was from an Argentinian show, which had a lot of music involved. And I would actually listen to that music outside of the show, even before I even started learning Spanish. And so the idea of learning Spanish through listening to music was very appealing to me. But the problem with it, and it's not necessarily a problem, it's more so just what makes it less effective. And that is simply because of the fact that you get better at what you do. And so if your goal is to be able to understand Spanish music, then by all means, listening to Spanish music will definitely help you do that. And obviously listening to it and then trying to understand it, right? You obviously don't learn by just listening and not asking, what does that mean? But the simple thing is, if your goal is to have conversations with natives, then the content that you should be basing your learning on shouldn't be music, but it should be conversations, because that's what you're trying to get better at, right? And so it's not like music won't help. It's just that if your goal is conversations, then watching conversations or interactions will just help a lot more because it's more conducive to the thing that you're trying to get better at, right? And so with that being said, let's start. Okay, so I'll have subtitles on, but these are auto-generated. So the first thing here is the first word that he said. Titi. Now, Titi is a word that it means auntie, right? But there's actually a concept here that's pretty interesting in Spanish. And that's like nicknames among Spaniards' families or like Spanish-speaking households' families. So Titi just means auntie, and it's specifically used in Caribbean Spanish. I'm pretty sure the guy performing Bad Bunny is from Puerto Rico. An interesting story about this is that when I was in Spain, living in a Spanish-speaking household, we had like this exchange program, right? And so I got to experience how it was like to be a Spanish-speaking family in Spain, in Sevilla. And what I found really like peculiar was that the parents would call each other mommy and papi. Dad, the mom would call the dad papi, and the dad would call the mom mommy. And to me, that was almost really weird. But in the household, it was completely normal. And so in that way, where the nicknames for mom and dad is mommy and papi, Titi, if you don't know, the word for aunt is tia in Spanish. And so Titi is kind of like that nickname sort of version of that. So that's where that is, okay? Kind of like how in English, a lot of us have, shortened nicknames for our grandparents almost. I know some people have like Gigi. There's a show called Young Sheldon. I think they call their grandma Gigi or something. Or Nini, or stuff like that, right? Where you do it for your grandparents. It's kind of like that. And by the way, if you're just getting started, I highly recommend joining the Speedy Spanish Hub, which is a free community I made with a bunch of resources and guides to help you start learning Spanish with these frameworks. And it'll be the first link in the description. So next up, I want to cover this part. So this is very interesting, okay? He said, Titi me preguntó. Now, this is very important. You guys have seen this thing right here a lot in Spanish, okay? It's known as the tilde, and it's like this line that occurs a lot, right? You can see it right here. It's like this dot, but it's like a line that's like slanted, okay? Now, in Spanish, there's a big difference between pregunto and preguntó, okay? They come from the same verb, which is preguntar, which is to ask, but they actually mean completely different things. So in conjugation in Spanish, okay, in the present tense, we take off the ar for our verbs and replace it with an o, okay? Now, this is for the present tense. And so pregunto means I ask or I am asking, okay? Now, and in the present tense, the stress of the verb, the actual emphasis, is actually in the beginning vowels or the beginning syllable. And so in this case, it's actually here on the U, okay? It's pregunto, right? Pregunto, te pregunto, I'm asking you, I ask you, te pregunto. Right? And you'll see this with every single conjugation, right? You'll see, for example, hablo, right? There is a difference between hablo and hablo, okay? Hablo has the emphasis on the beginning vowel, the vowel in the first syllable, you could say. Whereas hablo has it in the ending. Now, this is actually crucial in Spanish conjugation because when we reach the preterite tense, which I call the point in the past because it describes a point in the past where you're doing the verb, the past tense, okay? That's where we find stuff like habló, or in this case, preguntó, which is for the pronoun of he, she, it, and you formal, okay? And so preguntó means he, she, it, or you formal asked in the past, referring to the point in the past, okay? And so this is really important in Spanish. This happens all the time in Spanish, okay? We have stuff like the difference between hable and hablé. We have the difference between, or for example, for every other verb, we have presento and presentó, right? Presento, I present, I'm presenting. Presentó is he, she, it, or you formal presented, okay? And so this tilde right here, even though it looks super minor and a lot of English speakers like to avoid it, it's actually really important in Spanish and other languages. If you don't know, I was born and raised in Sweden, and a lot of Americans who try to read Swedish, they'll see like a letter like or ua or a, and they'll usually just completely ignore the little dots on top, which are actually super vital when pronouncing these letters. And so we don't want to do that in any language, and this includes Spanish. Okay, this tilde right here, this little squinted line is very important. It signifies where the emphasis is. And so there's a massive difference between pregunto and preguntó, right? I hope you can hear that difference. Pregunto, pregunto, it's on the U. Whereas we have preguntó, oh, preguntó. And so listen again and see if you can hear that emphasis on the o.
Hey, Titi me preguntó si tengo...
Me preguntó, to, right? Not pregunto.
Hey, Titi me preguntó si tengo mucha novia.
All right. Another part here. You can see the captions are actually getting it wrong, right? And this is very interesting in the lyrics as well. You can see in the lyrics here, we actually have this right here going on, okay? And this actually means that he's actually shortening a word. And what the real word here is muchas and novias. So far we have a, which just means a, Titi, meaning auntie, me means me, to me, or myself, me preguntó, which means he, she, it, or you formal ask me. In this case, it means she because we know that we're talking about Titi, which is auntie, which is a girl. So this means she asked. And the reason why the me comes before the verb is because object pronouns, aka the pronouns that receive the verb, okay, come before the changed verb. And so because we conjugated preguntar to preguntó, this has to come before that. So we have Titi me preguntó, my auntie asked me, si tengo, si means if, tengo means I have, in terms of possessing, like I have, like I possess. And it is irregular, but this go ending happens all the time in Spanish. So it's technically not completely irregular. Then we have this mucha, right? And this is where we go into the concept of what I like to call Spanish versus real Spanish. You see, most people learn Spanish the conventional way of memorizing ABCs, doing flashcards, doing Duolingo, etc. And it's literally why they never succeed. Because you probably already know this, but real-world Spanish sounds different than what school has been teaching us. And not only school, but basically every other source that isn't actual natives, like any type of text. Because if you ask yourself, how do Spaniards actually speak? You'd very quickly realize that they don't actually pronounce words and speak exactly how things are written. And actually, we don't do this in English either. In fact, in all four of my languages that I speak, I've realized the same pattern, that written text is actually completely different to how it's said in real life, in the real world. And the difference is actually massive, okay? So if I give you this example sentence of aquí estoy, escúchame, natives would actually say aquí estoy, escúchame. And this mucha and novia is an example of that, okay? And so basically what's happening here is we're replacing the S's with an H sound. It's like a, right? It's not the actual letter of H because the H's in Spanish are silent. And so you might be seeing this and wondering, okay, but how do I know that the S is there? Like, how do I know the difference between mucha and muchas if people are just going to, skip the S's? And the answer to that is just, it's contextual, okay? In this case, mucha novia wouldn't make sense because novia means girlfriend. And so a lot girlfriend doesn't make sense, right? Because a lot means that it's plural. We're talking about many, right? Mucha means many or a lot of or lots. So contextually we understand that it's actually muchas, even though they pronounce it mucha. Also, there is a difference in how it's pronounced. I'm going to get close to the microphone so you can hear it. We have mucha and mucha, right? There is a difference there. And so when learning Spanish, we do want to learn it the way that it's said by natives, because that's the whole point of learning Spanish. Our whole goal is to understand natives. And so if we don't listen and practice with what natives are saying, then why would we ever expect to understand them? And so this is where we see that. And so you're going to see this happen over and over again with mucha novia, mucha novia. So far we have Auntie asked me if I have a lot of girlfriends. That's what we have so far. The next line is mucha novia. Again, a lot of girlfriends. Just repeating it. Obviously, this is a song, so a lot of things are going to be repeated over and over again. And I'm not going to go through the entire performance because this clip is the one that's been circulating online a lot. But also because a lot of things I'm going through right now just happen over and over and over again. So it wouldn't really be necessary.
Ey, Titi me preguntó si tengo mucha novia. Ey, mucha novia. Hoy tengo una, mañana otra.
So here's another concept, and it has to do with this So he's repeating what he's saying hoy, which means today, tengo a una. Now this might seem out of place, because in English we don't say I have two, one, right? Means two, right? You've probably heard of I'm going to, voy a, right? But there's actually a very real reason to why this is here, okay? So firstly, what he's saying here is, today I have one, meaning one girlfriend. That's why it's una instead of uno or un. And obviously novia, girlfriend, is feminine. Then we have mañana, which means tomorrow, otra, which means other or another in this case. So he's saying, today I have one, tomorrow I have another, right? And you don't have to repeat this tengo because it's already implied. In the same way in English, you say, today I have one, tomorrow I have another, right? You don't have to say I have again. And the same thing applies in Spanish. Now, this is interesting, and it can actually be confusing grammatically because we understand that in Spanish is to, right? In the sense of, I'm going to, right? But there's two interesting points of when we have because if you watch my other videos, then you know that the way we translate verbs in Spanish is with the to, right? To speak is hablar, right? We've never, ever, ever translate hablar to just speak because that's extremely confusing and it doesn't account for the verb, right? Speak could be I speak, it could be to speak, it could be they speak, right? It's super unclear. And so you always want to translate verbs, whether it ends in ar, er, or ir, to the to version. Meaning you always have to put a to before it, or an ing after it, meaning speaking, okay? This is what the translation of, for example, hablar is. It's always to whatever verb and the ing of the verb, okay? And I have other videos going through the present tense of how to conjugate the present tense, so you can watch those if you want. And so when we see stuff like voy a hablar, I'm going to speak, this might seem redundant because if you translate it then, you might think that we're saying, I'm going to speak, which doesn't make sense. Why do we have this double to going on? And so the first rule of using in Spanish and with is that if they're added to verbs of movement, ir is a verb of movement. And so I'm going is a verb of movement, right? We're moving, we're going. Then we have to add this extra here. We have to have this extra So that's why it translates to I'm going to speak, okay? Here, in this case, hablar still means to speak. This extra is kind of like the bridge between voy and hablar, okay? Now, that's the first rule of It's for verbs that have movement, okay? So, for example, to bring, to come, right? Vengo a, right? Now, the second one is when this is referring to people. And so is used both to when we're referring to verbs of movement, but also to when we're referring to a person, right? And so going back to here, we understand that saying tengo a una makes sense. And so going back to here, we would say tengo una, I have one, right? But in this case, this is actually very necessary to show that we're referring to a person. And what person? We're referring to girlfriend, because girlfriend is a person. And that's the reason to why we have this It's referring to the person, okay? Now, obviously, this is a very small grammatical thing. And if you said tengo una, people will still understand you completely fine. But obviously, as an in-depth analysis, this is why. So starting from the beginning.
Ey, Titi me preguntó si tengo mucha novia. Ey, mucha novia. Hoy tengo una, mañana otra. Pero no hay boda. Titi me preguntó si tengo mucha novia.
Okay, these captions aren't really helping. I'll go back. So he said, Titi me preguntó si tengo mucha novia, or muchas novias. Muchas novias. Hoy tengo una, mañana otra, pero no hay boda. This is very simple here. Pero just means in the sense of, but I'm going to do this, but I do that, right? But no rolling R because there aren't the double R's here. No I means there is or there are. This no it just makes it negative. So there isn't would be no I, right? Or there aren't is no I. And then boda means wedding. And so he's saying, my auntie asked me if I have a lot of girlfriends. Today I have one, tomorrow another, but there isn't a wedding. Meaning he doesn't plan on marrying these girlfriends of his. And then it goes on to repeat the same thing, same concepts being used here.
Pero no hay boda. Titi me preguntó si tengo muchas novias. Ey, muchas novias. Hoy tengo a una, mañana otra. Ey, me la voy a llevar a todas pa' un VIP, ey.
All right, here we see a very egregious amount of real Spanish at play in terms of accent. And so let's break it down. So we basically repeated the lines, of course, since it's a song. And that's also another reason why using music as content might not be the best, because a lot of times they're just repeating the same things because it's a song, right? It has choruses and verses. So here we can see the lyrics, and you can see there's a lot of these like shortened parts, okay? And so let's walk through it. So firstly, if you listen to how he pronounces it, we see this dropping of the S again, right? He says mela. If you listen closely, he says mela. 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 The next part is this smushing together of two words, which we also see a lot, right? For example, we have ¿Qué estás haciendo? Might become ¿Qué estás haciendo? Right? And in this example, we have voy a turning into voy a. Boa. Basically, boa. It's basically becoming one word, okay? And breaking this down, we also know voy a means I'm going to. And this last means them. And in this case, it's feminine, referring to the girls, the girlfriends. So me las voy a, so I'm going to. And then we have the verb llevar. Now, llevar is interesting because it has a lot of different meanings. In this case, llevar, the first translation is to carry. But when you llevar a something, it means you're taking them in the sense of like you're taking them somewhere, right? And so he says llevar, and then we see here this a again, referring to todas. And so fixing this up, we see here another example of toa. And here what he's saying is todas. And obviously it's just a shortened way, right? One thing you'll see as well is that a lot of them will actually skip the D's as well when they speak real Spanish. And then we see another one here for pa, which actually means para, okay? So let's break this down, okay? So, me las voy a llevar. So obviously we see las referring to girlfriends. Makes sense? Voy a, I'm going to. We have llevar, which is to, in this case, to take. We're going to take them. Here we see this a referring to a person. All of them, all of the who, obviously the girls, the girlfriends, right? So that's why it's referring to the girlfriends. So I'm going to take all of them. And this me means me, to me, myself. In this case, it means with me. Now, that is a very niche case where it means with me. It usually, basically for 99% of sentences, me means me, to me, or myself. But he could have very well said, las voy a llevar a todas para un VIP. This me just adds a thing of like, they're coming with him, so it matters to him. Or he's taking responsibility of them. Then here we see para. And para, you might be really confused here because you might think that para means for, which it does. But here's an important part with Spanish grammar that I don't see a lot of people talk about, which is that the word for to, which is a, and the word for, which is para, are actually interchangeable in Spanish. In fact, most natives will actually use para instead of a. And so in this case, it's saying, I'm going to take all of them to a VIP, okay, which just means VIP. So this means, me las voy a llevar a todas para un VIP. I'm going to take all of them to a VIP. Okay? So that's what this actually means. But adding real Spanish to this makes it sound completely different. Because if you listen to the performance, it did not sound like he was saying, me las voy a llevar a todas a un VIP. No, it actually sounded completely different. And this is why I emphasize learning real Spanish instead of just what we think is Spanish, okay? This is Spanish in quotation marks. The real Spanish is what we see here. And it's what we hear here as well.
Muchas novias, hoy tengo a una, mañana otra. Ey, me la voy a llevar a todas pa' un VIP, ey.
So a lot of real Spanish was happening here, as I like to call it. So obviously the first one is getting rid of the S and making it sound like an H. So this sounded like me la, or just me la. Voy a, put together into one word, making it voy a. Llevar, being pronounced in a very, very Caribbean way. So out of all the things we see here, we're obviously dropping letters and combining words, but also we have a specific tone and accent here. And that tone and accent is the Caribbean Spanish or Puerto Rican Spanish, where a lot of times if a word ends in R, they'll pronounce the R like an L. So instead of saying hablar, they might say hablal. Hablal. Okay, hablal. And this is actually just a natural thing that happens when they speak. And this happens a lot in English as well. You might make the same pronunciation mistake, but in English. Llevar. Instead of para, we have the shortening to pa. Okay, and this is very normal in Spanish as well. Instead of para, they'll shorten it to pa, right? And so not only is para replacing a, but it's also getting shortened down to pa. So you could almost think that pa is the same thing as a. Okay? It's basically the same thing. It's just that natives will say para instead of just a lot of the times. And then we see un VIP, which just means a VIP, right? So now that we know the meaning of what he said, and now we also got the actual way that he pronounced it. And he pronounced the double L like a y sound. So he went, me la voy a llevar la toa pa un VIP. And if you listen to it carefully, you'll also hear that. Me la voy a llevar la toa pa un VIP, un VIP. So very slowly, me la voy a llevar la toa pa un VIP. And that's how he pronounced it, okay? Do you hear that difference between Spanish and quotation marks, which is me las voy a llevar a todas para un VIP, compared to me la voy a llevar la toda pa un VIP? There's a massive discrepancy between those two. And so it is extremely important. This is why, like, I say this to people all the time. Learn Spanish how it's said in real life, not how it's written, because there is such a massive discrepancy between those two. And obviously he is singing and he is having a singer accent, but let's be honest, he's basically just talking in this performance, or at least in this part of the performance, right? He has some A's here and there. He's basically talking. He's like rapping. So yeah, one thing I forgot to mention is also the V's in Spanish being pronounced like B's, but that's pretty basic. And here you can see vamos instead of vamos. You see tirarnos instead of tirarnos. Un selfie, here we see a bit of borrowing of words. We have literally an entire English phrase here, say cheese, because he's saying we're going to take a selfie, say cheese. So if you just keep watching this performance, you're going to see basically those same concepts that I was talking about being used over and over and over again, right? You can really hear all of the real Spanish here, right? Perfect vowels, speaking very fast, dropping a lot of letters, combining a lot of words, pronouncing the characters correctly, and having a specific tone and accent from Puerto Rico. And that's what defines real Spanish, okay? So if you've been learning Spanish for a while using Duolingo and stuff, and you were watching that performance and you're wondering like, why don't I understand a single thing that he's saying? The reason for that is because you've been studying Spanish in quotation marks. You've been studying this instead of how it's actually pronounced, like this, right? It's not supermercado, it's supermercado, right? Or it's not más tarde, it's más tarde. It's not qué estás haciendo, it's qué estás haciendo, right? And we see this a lot in this performance. Now, this is actually what makes an accent hard to learn, but it's also what adds real-life characteristics to a language. You see, we do this in English as well. And I've noticed this with every single language that I know. In Swedish, we pronounce jag like ja sometimes, right? So putting this all together, I'm going to first read it in the Spanish in quotation marks, meaning exactly what the words in Spanish actually were, which was, Titi me preguntó si tengo muchas novias, hoy tengo a una, mañana otra, pero no hay boda. Titi me preguntó si tengo muchas novias, hoy tengo una, mañana otra, me las voy a llevar a todas para un VIP, okay? Now, the way he said it was, Titi me preguntó si tengo muchas novias, hoy tengo una, mañana otra, pero no hay boda. Titi me preguntó, blah, blah, blah. Me las voy a llevar a todas para un VIP. Now going through the exact meaning here, he's saying, A, Auntie asked me if I have a lot of girlfriends. Today I have one, tomorrow another, but there's no wedding. Auntie asked me if I have a lot of girlfriends. Today I have one, tomorrow another. I'm going to take them all to a VIP. So yeah, that's what he was saying in the Bad Bunny performance. Obviously, I didn't go through the entire thing. I just went through the part that I just saw on TikTok, honestly. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope, you like this type of content where I use real life examples to sort of prove the frameworks, so to speak. If you want my help with learning Spanish, then you can check the second link in the description to join my program. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed and stay humble.